Welcome back to Education in Context, a space where we explore how education, community, and culture intersect to reimagine what learning can be for Black and Brown children. This is Beyond the Episode, where we take the conversation deeper with brilliant voices and you, our live community. In episode 4, we discussed how language shapes identity, perception, belonging, fear, and power. We discussed how words are never neutral. Language can humanize, erase, uplift, criminalize, and liberate or divide. Many of us learn language about communities long before we actually experience those communities ourselves. That conversation was grounded in the text Dog Whistle Politics by Ian Haney Lopez, where the author discusses how coded racial appeals, dog whistles shape public opinion, policy, decisions, and even how we as human beings see ourselves and others. Lopez reminds us that language becomes architecture for life. It builds narratives about who deserves safety, opportunity, trust, dignity, and power. So let's jump into it. Today, we are excited to continue that conversation with two special guests, Dr. Kevin Tracy, a doctor of education and current classroom teacher, and Dr. Elizabeth Jones, attorney, professor, and founder of Seed Club Consulting. So I'm really excited about this live. One of the things that I would love to do just to start our conversation, and I'll start with you, Dr. Elizabeth Jones, if you just want to tell us what resonated with you most as you watched the episode.
Yeah, so thank you, Larry and Nell, for having me on today. I really appreciate the invite to engage in this important conversation. And one thing that really stood out to me, and in particular really relates to the quote that you just talked about, is language is architecture, and how language shapes who deserves and who does not deserve, not just safety, but also resources. And so one thing that the episode made me think a lot about is this pernicious demagoguery, these, harmful, destructive forms of political rhetoric, that it's the ideological aspect of a material framework that denies Black and Brown children equal educational prospects, right? And so what I mean by that is to say that if we say children are criminalized, or that we provide certain labels to children, or we say that these children can't learn in the same way as other children, right? Then that almost to a degree justifies the denial of resources and access. And so I really think that that political rhetoric is connected to the material reality that we live in today. And in particular, we are in this era of late stage capitalism and neoliberalism. And I want to emphasize neoliberalism because one thing I wrote about in my dissertation is that neoliberalism, part of it is austerity governance, where we say, no, we're not going to fund public goods, right? Whether that's internet access or even public education. We're seeing a defunding. The Department of Education is being dismantled, right? And so neoliberalism on the one hand says government, the private sector should provide for these public goods, except for in the area of incarceration and punishment. And so if we criminalize a certain population, and if we say a certain population doesn't learn as well as another, then that in turn can justify that type of treatment. And so that's what really resonated with me from the previous episode.
I really appreciate you saying this piece around like the strategic ways that we then dismiss of or devalue certain bodies, because I think like if we think about in the school system, like very early on, people are able to do this through IEPs, which I know we discussed in the pre-live conversation. And once you put that in writing, this is a legal document that follows this child and has a narrative about who this child is, what this child can do, what supports they don't or do need, right? And then that is another way to be able to engage in exclusionary practices or to not provide them with the educational support that they need, because you're like, this child can't do X, Y, and Z, so don't expect this of them in theory.
Yeah. No, I think that's very real. I also think, when we think about, a student that might have an IEP or a 504, sometimes people associate that as there being a stigma around it, like you are this other, individual that is, has this deficit way of learning, which I think is a very problematic way to think about a person that has an individual education plan, especially because, that plan is a plan of support. And so, if you see that plan of support as, oh, this child can't do something, or they're not able to do something, that, feels problematic from the beginning. But then because, the framing of IEPs, or the way in which we position students in a classroom always kind of, still lends us to think in a deficit-based way about that student. And so I really appreciate us lifting this idea of how, when we label a student in an educational setting, it does impact the way in which, or it does impact their experience, and it also impacts what they internalize about themselves, as students in that space.
I was gonna say, and the thing that I like really appreciate about what Liz named is that it goes from this ideological thought that you are having about this child to material impacts, right? And I think that people often think, oh, it's just words, it's just blah blah blah, it doesn't really matter, nobody's in this meeting. And it's like, no, these things mobilize, like these things produce material impacts. And this is actually why it matters that we are very intentional with the language we use around who the student is, what they can do, etc., because this will follow them in their educational journey, not only what they internalize, but how people treat them as they go through the educational system.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. One of the big ideas that Lopez brought to the forefront in his book was this idea that, language describes reality, but it also shapes and constructs reality, and that we are told, stories about, groups of people, about communities, and those stories have real world impact, on those communities, and how they thrive or how they don't. And so I'm very curious to just, ask us, as we engage in this conversation, how do we think communities can interrupt those harmful narratives? Like, we know that they exist, we know they're in the world, we know, society perpetuates them through, all types of media, so how do communities move in solidarity to interrupt that?
I think one thought is to reframe how we're talking about our young people. A lot of times, and we talked about this previously, that our young people is referred to, what's wrong with these kids, right? Or what's wrong with these young people, instead of saying what's wrong with the environment that is producing children, who are really struggling in a lot of different ways to navigate a very difficult and complicated society, right? And so there's a really great quote in the documentary Katrina Babies, that's directed by Edward Buckles, and the woman's name escapes me, but she talks about how people always ask what's wrong with the children, what's wrong with the children, and she said there's nothing wrong with our children. Our children have experienced trauma, and they are trying to navigate that. Our children have cortisol running through their bodies, all day long. Their brains have been changed by some of the traumatic experiences they had. And so there's nothing wrong with the children, right? And so that reframing, I think, can begin to interrupt.
I really like how you named this thing around framing. I think that it lends itself to the conversation that I think Ian is having in the book Dog Whistle Politics, because it's also around what we normalize. If we normalize this narrative that something is wrong with the children, now we're operating as if the system is functioning well, right? As opposed to thinking about how do we start to articulate, I think I named this in one of the episodes around people being people to support as opposed to problems to solve. How do we articulate what is actually at play, the phenomenons we're navigating, from Katrina to COVID to the prison industrial complex, which children are consistently navigating in and out of, right? How are we articulating what is actually happening and not engaging in dog whistle politics that kind of tries to mask what is actually happening?
Yeah. Yeah, I also think, what's very true about the power of a story is that repeated narrative normalizes the assumption, like the assumption becomes truth, even if it's not truth at all. And then that also shapes how people feel. I fear this individual, or I'm not going to support this policy, or I'm not going to, or because a group or people are portrayed a certain way, in media, that then influences, how I treat them or how I, don't treat them. And I think all of that is indicative of like this, what Lopez describes as pernicious. There's a very manipulative trickery like at play when language is used, in that way and weaponized in that way against a particular group of people. And I think it's always the marginalized people, and it doesn't necessarily, reside in race. It resides in, a female over a male, or if you're able-bodied versus not being able-bodied. And I think there's just a lot to be said about the ways in which we use language to discriminate and marginalize people. And I think it's, there's a lot to be said about, okay, how do I then, move with the community that I'm within to kind of disrupt the narratives that I, for however long have internalized as being something that is, true, or what I think is true.
Yeah, I also think that something that you named that's sticking out to me is like you were saying how it can perpetuate like stereotypes, etc. But I also think the pernicious demagoguery lends itself to being able to sanitize the folks that are in positions of power that are engaged in this. So like on the episode Throw a Rock and Hide Your Hands, like when we are able to use language to puppeteer almost, right?
Yeah.
People cannot really hold you accountable to any particular thing. And I think I talked about this with you when I was watching that reel about the Voting Rights Act and how like the courts were like, all right, now you need to prove intent of racism. Like, how I have to prove, like, based off what? Like, I have to ask this person, were you thinking about being racist? You know what I'm saying? Like, I think it allows people to live in that world of how can you prove they intentionally chose to do it if they're just called you boy. Like, you know what I'm saying? They use a
Yeah.
racially neutral word. I
Yeah.
cannot prove this, even though the impacts show it is racist or it is insert anti-Black violent thing,
Yeah. One thing, Larry, you made me think of this, and no, I had not thought about how it can be used to absolve people of being accountable, but this idea of language, and we label this group and it therefore justifies a certain type of treatment. I think about having practiced youth defense in Louisiana and New Orleans specifically, and thinking about things that were done to children. So there was a population in secure custody that which is basically you jail, right? Which is a whole other question about framing, like, do we think that our youth who are in most need will benefit from being incarcerated away from their families? But that's a whole other conversation. So there was a population of young people who were considered ungovernable. They couldn't be handled. And so they were sent to what were called transitional treatment units. There was a article in ProPublica. They were put in a retrofitted sheriff's jail, were basically in solitary for 23 hours and 15 minutes a day. They did not receive school. And we're talking about children who did have IEPs. So, who not only should receive educational service, but also had a need for additional support services. And I feel like you could only justify this treatment of children because of who that population is, because it was young, poor Black children from New Orleans, and this idea that they're unredeemable, incorrigible, the super predator idea, right? And so then you have this paper trail that's been created, and rather than saying, here are best practices treatment, right, we respond with jail. And so that's what, just in practice, that's what this makes me think of.
Yeah, I also think like I think something I say in the episode is around how, like, currently in the political climate, how we frame national security, and something that Liz just said to us around, like, determining people as unredeemable, or determining populations as inherently violent, or etc. I think about this one student that we had come to our school who had spent majority of his middle school time in jail, right? He had been in jail for the majority of the time. And so we were receiving him as a transfer student, and that was the context that was given to us. And when we had the reentry meeting, he had an advocate there. His uncle was there who had custody of him. It was him. And then the administrators at the table having his reentry meeting. And I thought about, like, wow, the ways that the principal came out of that space so afraid and worried about what she was accepting at her school was so interesting to me, because I'm like, okay, like, he has an advocate here. So in her mind, she's like, what harmful thing has this child done? Why they have an advocate here, right? That his parent is not there. His uncle has custody of him. So and instead of framing this as like, what is the support that this child is going to need? Because that is what I had to insert and reframe the conversation with, like, hey, I hear you. You want to have him on escort. You want to have him on all these things, etc. While he's at school. However, he has done nothing at our school. And what this sounds like to me is that he has a lot of trauma. So it sounds like he's going to need a lot of support in being here. So although this is not my role, I'm going to actually commit to checking in with him in the morning and asking him what is his goal for the day, who wants to be successful, and checking in with him at the end of the day. And so he has an adult in this building that he trusts and cares about his success. Because what it sounds like is a lot of adults have failed him, right? Like, it's like a lot of adults have failed you until this point, and you need support. But because we do not view children as people to support, we view them as problems to solve. All of these things happened where the response was, oh, red flag. How do we protect the rest of the students from this child? I'm like, this child has spent the majority of their middle school in jail. Like, they don't actually have basic social skills to navigate being in school, right? Like, how are we supporting them with developing that? And I remember in the meeting, the uncle was there and he said, I really wish that when I was in school, somebody showed up for me how you're showing up for my nephew right now, because I didn't have this support and they didn't really care about what happened to me. And so I ended up in jail because that was my environment. That's all I knew. And he was like, my nephew, his mom is schizophrenic. His dad was incarcerated by the time he was 12. So that's why I had custody of him. I was actually the only person to even be like, all right, I'll just take him in. And so I'm like, I'm glad you had that experience, that you're experiencing this as a support, because that's what I want it to be, right? Because I recognize, I was like, oh, we're going down a path of protect. And it's like, protect from a child? Like, you don't even know what happened, like, but it lends itself to what Liz said around, like, people create the narrative and now everyone is in, like, how do we protect the world or the masses from these children?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I am thinking about that both of you all lifted was that the situation of the children that find themselves, in these particular situations is very nuanced. It's very contextual. There's a lot of other factors that is influencing the reason why this child is here. Oftentimes, I would argue the situations are external to the child. The child is experiencing something, or something is put upon this child, and they, being children, being dependent on adults that are failing them for whatever the reasons are now have to navigate, a very difficult situation. And so I think that's why it's so important not to judge or to make assumptions or to use like dog whistle language to, describe a child or a child situation, because it can re-traumatize and be even more harmful to a student. I also think one of the things that Lopez really gets at when we think about dog whistle politics is this idea that kind of language is fear-based. There is language that is repeatedly being associated with a certain group of people to describe them as dangerous, criminals, lazy, unstable, and that because of the labels that we put on, this person or these group of people, we're willing to accept, this way of extreme punishment or extreme surveillance or extreme exclusion or some kind of other, inequitable, situation that is then forced upon them by the system. And I think that is what you were kind of getting at, Nell. Like, instead of you all looking at this child as a child that, has had multiple experiences forced upon him that now he has to navigate as a child, you all are recriminalizing him as he's trying to be reintegrated back into school, which feels insidious. So
insidious.
Yeah.
It also makes me think about adults. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, I know you were about to say adultification, but I wanted to ask you two as educators in particular. I have a question for you two as educators, because I feel like what Nell is speaking to is something I definitely experienced again as a youth offender. I was a former teacher as well, charter school, way long time ago. But, is there a pressure on school administrators to, we hear about push the kids out before the test? Can you all speak to that? Is there some kind of pressure, or do you think that no, the structures are not in place to support youth in this way? I'm curious about your perspective about that, because I do hear what Nell is saying, and I feel like I've experienced that with other school administrators, like what is coming into my school, and then when you craft this like surveillance, well, how does that child feel? It's like, from one almost jail to another, somebody's always watching. So I was just curious about your experiences and thoughts about that.
I sent it to myself.
Larry, you can go first if you want.
Yeah, I think there is a
you can't. It's not a link
system
that you have to click
that
the button.
administrators have to navigate, like CPS code of conduct or any other, like,
No, you don't. You press a button.
Code of conduct by a school system. I think that sometimes we walk a fine line of trying to follow whatever the protocol is and also humanize the student, because again, they're children that are navigating in extremely difficult circumstance. Sometimes it's by themselves or with other people that don't have or aren't equipped with the skill set to really support that child. And so I think, depending on what the administrator's experience has been, if the administrator does not have the proper skill set to be sensitive to the nature and to understand the context in which, a child is being brought into the space or brought into a school for whatever the reasons might be, I think that within itself, can be harmful to a child, because now we have an inexperienced administrator handling a very complicated situation, which is why I would argue that, I think we need to do more to really vet the principals and the assistant principals and the teachers. But just like people that work in a school setting, I think we don't see the work of education as important work. And we see it in the fact that educators are disinvested in making sure that they are doing their job of fidelity. And so, but that actually starts at the top. It's like the saying goes, the fish rots from the head. So I think that's part of the problem, for sure.
But I also think that I started to speak about this a little bit before we started the live, around how I really am asking myself, do I want to work with students in this way long term? And it's because of the fact that, yes, we have to navigate things like CPS code of conduct, etc., but also like it necessitates mindset work to do school administration well, because you are put in positions where you do have the code of conduct in front of you, but you have to be able to make nuanced decisions around, where am I forcing my hand? Where am I extending grace? Where am I being like, this is the support we're going to provide this kid, as opposed to suspension, expulsion? And if you don't have the mindset, if you haven't done the mindset work around the ways in which you might have a propensity to be afraid of Black and brown kids, and you run a school of Black and brown kids, you're going to lean punishment. You're going to lean push out. You're going to lean expulsion, right? Even if you could have leaned another direction, that's not even in your schema, because you're operating, to your point, Larry, under fear. And you're like, all right, push out. All right, problem solved. like, as opposed to let me take a moment to humanize this child and think about what still protects the school community, because it does matter. If the child is doing something that's harmful to the school community, you do need to consider that in your decision making. And you need to consider the fact that this is a child whose brain is not fully developed, who is a product of whatever experiences they've had. How do I navigate this intentionally, mindfully? But that requires mindset work that a lot of principals are not doing. They're just like, I have too much stuff on my to-do list. Check it off, expelled, gone, suspended, like done.
Yeah. Kevin, I would love to bring you in on the idea of like how administrators or teachers navigate situations where children are maybe they're being brought into a school, maybe they're transferring into the school or they're starting at a school and they're coming with a complex situation that, may have had them in a juvenile system, and like what your experience has been with that, both as a teacher in the space, but also as a teacher that has had to work with administrators to support children in that kind of setting.
It's really funny that you say that, because you would think that whatever the background of the student is, right? You would want to believe that administrators are going to welcome them with open arms because of, one, this child needs an education regardless of where they've have been. But what majority of the people don't know is typically records come before student, right? So when records are received, there is this notion of who this student is before the student walked through the door, right? So we read the report, not really interacting with the student. So we'll read the report, and I'll include myself in this because I work in a school. We'll read the report. We'll make our own assumptions of who this kid is, like what caused him to leave, and based on those preconceived notions, right? We've already maneuvered the student of how we want them to flow through the building, right? Before they open their mouth, before we get, to hear their side of the story, we've already have made those decisions for them, right? Now, we've determined the classes that they're going to be in. We determined how they're going to move through the building, right? Especially if they one that has moved through, right, being incarcerated halfway, like whatever the situation is in the system. Because, and I guess from an administrative standpoint, right, safety is their biggest concern, right? But again, from an equitable standpoint, right, every student deserves an equitable education, right? So regardless of kid wearing a bracelet, regardless of their PO coming to school with them, regardless of what those situations are, right, we have to view those kids as a kid who can receive a high quality education. And I think because the records come before the student, there isn't any time when the student gets there to have a conversation with the student like, yo, listen, I get, whatever the situation is, like, this is a fresh start for you. Like, how can I help you navigate through navigate school, but also the system that you are now a part of? Like, listen, I don't know if you really want to go where you headed if things not right, but let's have this real conversation. Like, yo, I'm gonna help you stay on the straight and narrow. But again, I think this is a conversation that I think everybody needs to be involved. Like, we can have a conversation with the student to be like, yo, listen, tell me what you need for you to be successful here in this building, so you don't have to go back to wherever they say you have to go, right? Whatever is going to constitute you to violate probation or whatever the situation is. Like, yo, let me help.
Yeah.
And I think to Nell's point, like, there's so many things going on in the school that people tend to shy away from that. And that's a problem, because it's so funny, because I'm actually writing an article right now that talks about, like, from the child's standpoint, right? The minute they walk through the door, they have their own perception. Like, they have their own perception now, right? How are these people going to treat me if they know that I got to monitor or I got to walk with a PO? Like, are they going to, people are going to greet me? Are they going to treat me like a human? Or are they going to be like, yo, just sit over there in the corner, fill out these papers, turn it in, and go about your business, right? Like, they have their own perception. So we can't be mad when they are now sitting in class and uninterested, like, yo, I don't really want to be here. Somebody look at me as I'm hooking the first person. Like, they're on defense too. You have to also keep in
Yeah.
mind that they are hyper aware because of the environment they come from. So they have to feel like somebody is going to protect them. And as a whole, a collective, I don't think we deal with that enough, right? If they're going to be put into a traditional setting, right, environment, school environment, I don't think
Mhm.
I also think we just missed the mark because something that I'm glad Kevin said was this piece about records getting sent before the child does, because I think it,
Mhm.
it double stamps what Liz was saying earlier around ideological transferring into material impacts, because it's like, if I've already created a narrative, and I think Kevin had not been in the call at that time when I was like, when this little boy came to our school, they was ready for escort all the. I'm like, whoa, okay, let's pause. Hey, I actually don't care what happened when you wasn't here. This is what support is going to look like while you're here, because I really want you to thrive. And it's so crazy because unfortunately that child ended up getting back reincarcerated. And when he did, like, he literally called his uncle to call me to put me in three-way. Like, he's like, I'm not gonna be out for a minute, but I just wanted to say thank you because you always saw me as my full self. And it was so crazy because it made me think about how, like, we do not humanize children, we do not humanize adults, but we really don't humanize children to be like, how do I see you in a way that is like, let's look forward? Because to Kevin's point, that is going to shape everything about their experience. And this child feeling like, okay, somebody cares, somebody believes in me, might be the belief they need to actually navigate school in a way where they find some semblance of success, you know?
Nah,
I
you
would
know what's
also
crazy?
add,
Nah, go ahead, go
oh,
ahead, go
go
ahead. Do
ahead,
you think?
Dr.
Do you think?
Kevin. No, Dr.
Nah, do you
Kevin, go
think? Do you think
ahead.
that?
Okay.
Chill with that.
Well,
No, I was gonna say,
Don't all jump in at once.
yo,
I'm dead. Go Liz, go Liz.
No, I was just gonna say, and especially to be on this call with educators, and I'm having flashbacks of being the attorney slash educational advocate because I was doing those things as well, and so feeling like I'm the bad guy, right? Like I'm going in the and I'm like, well, show me where the child is receiving their IEP services, or show me, and I'm trying to advocate for this child so this child can be successful. And I feel like they looking at me like this child is a lost cause. Or I had a child with an IEP who was supposed to have a one-to-one para, and it's like, I'm sorry y'all don't want to pay for this, but like somebody got to pay for it. And I will say, I do think that is another bind that folks get in, is that they really clock like this is going to be expensive to provide this support. And if you got a kid who needs a one-to-one para, that's expensive, right? And, some of them, this is federal law. Like, you have to provide this to these young people. But yeah, y'all giving me like flashbacks of having to go to MDR hearings and be like, no, this is the
Hated
child's
NPR hearing.
disability.
Hated.
But the other thing about that is how many young people navigate without an advocate, navigate without an attorney, because I know well-educated parents who have challenges and difficulties gaining educational access for their children and getting their IEP services met. So that's my 2 cents.
And I've had teachers tell me about their MDR meetings and be like, I did not feel good in that meeting because of the language that was being used to describe the child, or the lies that were being told around what the support the child was getting. And I'm like, you should have said something, right? It made me think about, name you normalize, like, but it makes me think about how, like, these things happen. And to Liz's point, if nobody is there aware, nobody is there present that can advocate for you, you're going to experience injustices or potentially like violences that impact your life for the rest of your life, right? And so it's like even more important that we are intentional with the language we're using verbally, but also in written communication as we are making these federal documents for students that follow them in their journey.
Kevin, what was your thought earlier?
no. So I was just gonna say, I don't think, yo, I this is just my personal belief that I don't think enough people are aware on how language, one, specifically towards Black people, like how it matters, how words that administrators use, teachers use, even some parents use towards their own child, right? How that does something to their psyche when they're now entering the space of education where this is a place that I'm supposed to learn, right? So I came in a little bit and you guys were talking about like how some teachers or administrators will expel kids and, and push them out, right? I don't think enough educators are aware of, right, how adultification plays a part in the decisions that adults make, especially towards Black and brown students in this school, right? We are held at a higher expulsion rate, suspension rate for the same, I guess, crime or offense in schools than any other demographics in education. But because society views them as a threat or a harm, the administrator feels like the gavel has to be swung even harder to ensure, I guess, that their school is a safe place, right? But not really understanding how suspending them for 45 days, 90 days allows that student to come back with the bracelet now on my ankle, and I'm the one now to listen. If things would have been done a little differently, maybe I don't have this bracelet on. Right? But I don't think there are so many administrators that take the time to look at it from that point of view or for even that lens, right? Like, I understand that there is an offense that was given. Let's hold everybody accountable, right? So if John gets 45 days for fighting, Peter needs to get 45 days for fighting. Like, that's just what it needs to be. It needs to be clear. But again, another thing too, right, to go to the parents and the advocates, right? If they're unaware of the system that is at hand where certain students are not getting expelled or suspended at the same rate, they're just going to be like, all right, my kid got suspended. Stop doing what you're doing. And when the suspension lifts, you're going to go back to school. Not really understanding the ramifications of not really truly advocating for their kid. Like, going to school. Like, I understand that, but does it got to be 45 days? Where in the handbook does it say this, and that? Can it be? Or if you're going to send my student home for 45 days, there has to be some learning that is happening outside of school as opposed to like sending the kid home with a packet for 45 days. Does he get a tutor at the lot? Like, what is happening?
Yeah, no,
it's sorry,
I definitely agree. Go for it, Dr. Jones.
No, Dr.
Jump
Kevin
in.
made me think of people are scared of our kids. Like, let's name the thing, right? Like, we have all seen the social media about YNs, right? We have seen the TikToks. If I'm walking down the street in a group of Y, our kids see this. They know what we refer to them as. They know if they in their poo shiesty, right? And so what does this say about our society? What does this say about us when our kids are navigating a world where the adults responsible for their care are scared of them? So that's just crazy to me.
Yeah.
It actually makes me think about, maybe this was in the last episode, Larry, that we just filmed, where I talked about Philando Castile and how, like, when the officer shot him and he kept shooting after Philando was dead, and
Yes.
and like how it very much is. And before Kevin, it's so crazy Kevin brought up adultification, because I was going to talk about adultification, but it's like, if people are afraid of our kids, like, there's actually footage of schools that I've worked at, and I'm not even going to name them, of the person responsible for discipline running away from the fight. And like, I'm so confused, because I'm just like, why would we hire people that are afraid of our kids? Like, what are the things that we are putting in place for interviews, etc., to have a guardrail against? You cannot be afraid of our kids and be responsible for discipline. You cannot be afraid of our kids and be responsible for safety, because you're going to position them as the thing that needs to be kept safe from, as opposed to figuring out how to create a safe environment for them. And so I think the adultification piece plays such a huge role, especially now that I'm at the high school level, because these people really think these kids are adults. And I'm like, this is
they're still children. Yeah.
I don't care that you're going to be 18 in 2 months. I was a child at 20. I don't care.
Right?
child. Like, you know what I'm saying? And so for me, it's like, we do not allow Black and brown children to have access to innocence in a way in which they deserve. And so because of that, these people are tallying in their head like, well, when they have to do the expulsion hearings, you have to create a case. It's essentially a case against the child. And I remember this lady saying, oh, this is good, because I remember one time I was in the hallway, she said X, Y, and Z to me, so I'm going to bring that up now. And I was just like, I literally was sitting there like, what is the goal in this? And so, yes, I get accountability. Yes, understood. This child did an unsafe thing. And why are we trying to paint this child as a villain or as this very harmful thing, as opposed to someone that made a poor choice? And needs support, right? Like, how are we, I don't know. And to Liz's point, if people are afraid of our kids, they cannot be given the power to dictate their futures.
Yeah.
But you know what's crazy now that you say that, right? Like, if people are afraid of our, my thing is too, right? So if we are looking at society as a whole, right, there is certain language when we're talking about schools that are predominantly Black that media uses, administration uses, that we don't even know what the name of the school has to be. But if we hear it if they give a description of what's happening at the school, the viewer can be like, well, we know that they don't look like us, or they look like us, just based off the description, right? So society also plays a role in it, right? So even though you were talking about high school, I immediately thought of, so when I was going to high school in New York, I went to 2 different schools, right? One school in a neighborhood that served predominantly Black people. Boys and girls went through 2 separate doors through metal detectors. I went to school. I ended up being really well in baseball. Went to go to another school to play baseball, like on a scholarship. I lied to you not. It's probably 25 minute different opposite location. Everybody going through the door. Like, so when I first got there, it was like a culture shock. So I'm like, what door do I have to go in? They're like, what you mean, what door you have to go in? I'm like, what? I'm a male. What door do I go through? No metal detectors, but more things happened at that school because it was in a certain area than the school that I came from, where it was just like, nah, it was like Fort Knox getting in here. But it was just the language that was used. And what a lot of people don't understand is, in this area, the community dictated if that school was going to have metal detectors because of the property value. And I was just like, what? Like, so just because it devalues your property, you're willing to allow certain things to carry on in this school if it does happen, just to protect your pockets. Where in certain neighborhoods we are heavily policed because we want to prevent anything from happening here. And then if it does happen, we have a reason to justify why we even have those police, right? So the language is valid in that certain demographic, which is wild to me.
Yeah, pernicious demagoguery, as Lopez says. Yeah, one of the things that I think is very true, in all of the conversation that we've had, is that words are containers for power. Like, there's a lot of power in the language that we're using to describe our children or to describe communities or people. And I think to that point, that's why it's so important that we are careful, cautious, mindful of what we say, how we say it, how we describe, each other and our children, because it really does matter. As we continue along in our conversation, I'm really curious to talk to you all about how we then reclaim the language that we're using as a tool for liberation. We've talked at length about how language can harm. We also know language can heal. We also know communities, historically have used language to reclaim their identity by naming the truth, honestly, by affirming each other in community, assigning dignity. telling the other narratives that are rooted in like the humanity of the cultural heritage that we share, and the cross cultural heritage that we share, in the United States in particular. So I'm curious to just talk a little bit about what we think liberatory language sounds like, if we are trying to reframe this way of speaking about each other or speaking about the children. Man, we was all ready to jump in just a few minutes ago.
Yo,
No, I'm just kidding.
I was trying to make room for that. I was trying to make room for that.
Yeah.
But I was just gonna say, I try and be very intentional when I'm moving through the school building with how I speak to students. Like, I'm very much like, "Hey, queen," to every little black girl in that building. Like, and I'm always like, "Hey, son." The boys be like, "Everybody can't be your son." I said, "Y'all are my sons." Everyone. Right. And I very much want to communicate like that this is a community. You are safe here. I am a safe adult that cares about your success, and children feel that, trust that, believe that. There's, and the student that I'm thinking about, Mr. Larry, but one of the students that transferred to our school this year, he had, when his entry meeting, they asked him like, why this school? Why'd you choose this school? And he was like, "I'm not gonna lie to you, Miss Williams." Like his mom was like, "Yup." And I'm like, that's crazy, because it's like, it's a testament to not only the relationship that I built with that family, but also how they equate feeling safe and trusting an institution to their relationship to me. And I think that's why it's very important for us to be mindful of like how we're counteracting narratives through our interpersonal interactions, but also like at the table in conversations about policy, how we're interrupting problematic things that are being in place.
Yeah. One thing I'm thinking about is, and I think I've had a number of situations this year where I've had to push teachers on how they're describing students. I think often we like to use people first language. This person, these people, but maybe it's just this action, or this thing that has happened. And I think taking the human out of the scenario and just talking about the action that was taken. Today I had and I told you all a bit earlier, I dealt with some physical altercations that happened at the place that I work at, and one of the individuals that I work with, had a lot to say about this particular student, always being into something. And, data says two things. Yes, this particular student has had a number of instances this year where they've made poor decisions. And when I talk to the student about the poor decisions that they've made, I'm talking about the decision. I'm talking about the action. I'm not talking about them as a human, as a person, as a student at this school. Because I think the other thing that's very true about human nature is that we are creatures of habit, and we learn habits through, when I think about a child, through the adults in our life. Children are always taking in information and seeing models of how they should be in life. And so, when I think about this particular child in the context of his situation, he or they have probably had things modeled in their life. They've been exposed to things that in their mind, oh, I can do this thing that's actually in real life problematic. And so for me, it's like, how do I help this child learn something different? How do I help them, be in conflict with someone and resolve it without using their fists? Because I think that is how we kind of shift away from having this way of thinking that problematizes the individual. Because I think the other thing, and I ask children this, I'm like, who wants to go to an unsafe school? Who wants to go to a violent school? Who wants to go to a school where they don't feel safe? No one tells me they do. Because no one wants to go to a school like that. And so, and I ask this to the children that are fighting, because if the children that are fighting don't want to go to a violent school, yet you are in that moment taking an action that encourages violence, then that is an aha moment for them. Oh, let me reflect, because I don't want to go to a violent school. How can I handle this conflict differently? And so, when I think about what does it look like, for us to use liberatory language, I think about and we talked about this now, like metacognitive, thinking. How do I help a child think about how they're thinking in this situation to resolve their issue? If the way in which they're trying to resolve their issue is not for the benefit of the community, and I think that's the piece. Dr. Jones, I don't know if you've had any experiences with how you've tried to help reframe the ways in which children are navigating some of the more difficult situations that you've supported them in.
So I was really trying to chew on this question because it was a great question. But first I want to lift up a book that relates to a big part of our conversation. Chris Henning wrote a book called Rage of Innocence, and it's about the juvenile justice system, and essentially the subtitle is How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And I think that's an important book to read. But as an attorney representing children, I had to use more, I don't know if it was liberatory language, right? Because I think a liberatory language is a little bit different from a reframing. But in court, I would always have to say, okay, this child has this diagnosis, but let's talk about it in this way. Let's not, let's reframe, right? Or even like a judge said to a child one time, this child hasn't looked at me and they've been playing with their hair the whole time. And I had to say, well, judge, this is a TBRI court, which is, I think it was like trauma-based. It was supposed to be a trauma-informed court. And I was like, judge, this is a trauma-informed court. And that can be a sign of nervousness. This is a very serious situation. You make it a determination whether or not this child is going to remain incarcerated. And trying to explain to them, like, you are reading this behavior this way. Please try to read it a different way. But I think to use more liberatory language, and I'm going to be brief in this one, I think we got to interrogate our own anti-Blackness that we are all reared in this anti-Black society. I think that's the number one thing. And then I think too, we gotta, I know this may sound strange, but we have to read more, right? Pedagogy of the oppressed. Like, read your revolutionary ancestors, right? Read Asada. Yes. Go pick up H. Rap Brown's autobiography. If you can't get a child to read, I bet you a child will read H. Rap Brown's autobiography, right? And so, like, read, know where you come from so you can have this reorientation. And I think that will lend itself. And we can't just have the language. I think Nell alluded to this. We got to have the liberatory safe spaces. So that's what I think.
I really appreciate you lifting that. Kevin, did you have a thought?
Nah, so it's crazy because as Dr. Jones was speaking, right, I think an accountability also needs to be had. Because how is it that the judge in that courtroom doesn't understand that is like, how does the judge, the person that is about to make the decision whether this kid is going to have to go, you know what I'm saying, whatever the consequences, how does the judge not just for a second humanize the situation? Like, yo, if you were the one in this situation and your life is about to be at somebody else's hands and this is a trauma-infused court, like, I'm pretty sure you are either tapping your feet, sweating, or even playing with your hairs. But to not even acknowledge that because you have this high position and you are the one that has the authority, I think it's just the lack of, or it might not be a lack of, you don't have to, right? You don't have to put yourselves in other people's situation, right? I think so. Empathy needs to be there. I think accountability needs to be had. And I think it just needs to be done in an environment or in a way that it doesn't offend anybody, right? Because colleague to colleague, I should be able to check you if I hear something that is, that raises my eyebrow if you're talking to a kid that looked like me. Because in my mind, you think you could talk to me like that, like. So I think it's an accountability thing too. And it's also a willingness to want to improve yourself, and I think reading is the way to do that. Honestly,
yeah, I'm really glad, Dr. Jones, that you lifted that, because I think not enough. And Nell, you've said this in some episode we did, some live we did, that not enough people read. But I also think that, to your point, Kevin, I think people find themselves are in these positions and they actually are not equipped to do their job effectively. And they have so much power in that moment to transform and change the entire, life trajectory of, the people in which, they are presiding over. I'm thinking about this judge in this instance. I also think the other thing, and I kind of mentioned this in a previous conversation that I had with you, Dr. Jones, this idea, I actually was describing this class that I'm taking right now when we're reading this book by Ivan Illich about deschooling society, and it talks about how children, oftentimes are not afforded the same constitutional rights that adults are afforded, that are in controlled environments, that are in prisons, that are in psych wards, or whatever, the controlled environment might be. Those adults have constitutional rights that they can assert, but then children within schools or within, these other systems like the juvenile system, they're not afforded the same rights because they're dependent, or, they're seen as a child that just doesn't have the same rights, which means that I can treat you or speak to you any particular way, which I think is inherently problematic. And the book really talks about how the way in which we orient ourselves to this way of schooling, humans, is inherently problematic because there is a lack of regard for the rights of the child in that moment. And so I really appreciate you lifting that. Nell, if you have a thought, you want to come off mute?
I know that we're coming to an end soon, but I just wanted to name that something that Kevin said, and then you just said that made me think about, like, Kevin said something around, like, not only just like with students or with leadership or with colleagues, but also within our communities, how it is important for us to be mindful of the language that we're using. And the reason why what you just said made me think of that is because I think about, like, language in our communities, like a child needs to stay in a child's place, or like that type of language that is very problematic to me, because it just assumes that a child is not a person with critical thinking skills that is capable of having information. And we are such flawed, like, humans are so just flawed beings that it feels very narcissistic for you to think that this child has nothing to offer in this conversation. And so I always think about now, like, even with unlearning from my parents, as I'm navigating being a mom, I'm always telling them, like, I'm so sorry, that's not actually how you're gonna say that to her, like, Amora, and I'll ask a question, like, and the reason why I'm doing that is because we really need to unlearn in schools and outside of schools this idea that we have all this power over a child. Yes, you are responsible for the safety of this child. I said all of that is true. And this child has autonomy to say, please do not touch me. Like, to say, like, a child should have autonomy to say those things, and you think they are your property. And so within our communities as well, we have to really unlearn that idea of, like, even when I have conversations with my daughter, I'm like, would you like for me to have said that to you like that? She'd be like, no. I'd be like, so why are you talking to me like that? She'll be like, right. And it's not off the strength that I'm your mom, you're the child. It's off the strength of I'm a human, you're a human. I'm not talking to you like that. So why are you talking to me like that? You know what I'm saying? And so I think even at 3, she is aware of the fact that, like, this is not how we communicate with each other, because we're both humans, not because I'm an adult and you're a child. That means nothing, right? And so I think just really unlearning these power structures or relationships, even within interpersonal connections.
Yeah. We have one question from the chat that I do want to lift. And yeah, I know. And feel free to chime in on it. In terms of language, is Black and brown 2 different kinds of people, or just 2 manifestations of the color spectrum? I know when we say Black and brown, we're talking about the different groups of people that identify as an individual of color that is not white. So, that person might be from Latin America, that person might be, from a part of Africa, that person might be a person that lives within the United States that identifies with a certain cultural group. But it's a general way to describe people of color. I think one of the things that I am always hyper focused on when I think about the terms of saying black and brown, especially for black people, is just this idea that a lot of the racist ideology, that is perpetuated within the United States in particular, stems from the racist language that was circulated amongst the way in which you described enslaved African Americans. And so I think it's really important that when we are thinking about, the way in which we use language, and I appreciate the viewer that raised this comment, is to, again, be very reflective of how you're describing groups of people, because it does matter. It does matter. Any other thoughts around that?
The only thing I'll say there is I do think it is important to make the distinction between black and brown, just because ways in which Liz named this around how anti-blackness permeates a lot of spaces. Anti-blackness absolutely permeates spaces that are people of color but may not identify as black, and a lot of like Afro-Latinas speak to this, right? A lot of like East Asian folks speak to the colorism that happens there. And so I think anti-blackness happens with even in our own communities. That distinction is really important, just to delineate the experiences as well, because they are different, not to compete in them, but to say that there are different experiences that exist within POC communities or people of color communities.
Yeah, and this was a great conversation. As we close out, I just want to lift a couple of things. Language is never just language. The words that we use become policy. Those words become assumptions. Those words turn into systems. Those words become mirrors about how we see ourselves and ideas and messages that we internalize about ourselves. But those words can also become bridges to truth, bridges to ways in which we heal ourselves and we heal within our community. And so, the challenge that we all have before us is to not only disrupt the harmful narratives that we hear, but to also challenge each other and challenge ourselves to think about new ways of describing communities where we have, so we can replace those narratives of assumptions and biases and racist ways of thinking. Because when our narratives are rooted in dignity, when our narratives are rooted in truth, and when our narratives are rooted in humanity, we all thrive. And so I want to leave our viewers today with this idea that the stories that we tell do become the societies that we build and that we live in. I really want to thank our guests today, Dr. Jones and Dr. Tracy, for joining us for this amazing conversation. If you would like to chime in on this episode, please use the hashtag EducationInContext and visit our website at educationincontext.org. Thank you.